the roar of a Rover V8 down the high street, the distinctive rattle of a Vauxhall Cavalier's engine in the morning, the smell of petrol and turtle wax on a Saturday afternoon. If you were there, you know exactly what I'm on about. We've hunted down 20 cars from 90s Britain that have virtually vanished from our roads, and some of them might just make you misty-eyed. The Ford Sierra Cosworth was the car that made every lad want to work overtime. That aggressive whale tail spoiler, the turbo whistle, the way it hunted down supercars on the motorway. It was a genuine performance car that actually worked, and you could buy one for proper money. Young blokes saved for years to get one, and when they did, they treated it like their first love. The insurance was a nightmare, sure, but nobody cared when you heard that turbo kicking in. By the late 90s, they were becoming rarer, and the tuning scene was moving on to other platforms. Now they're collector's items, fetching silly money at auctions. But in the 90s, they were just brilliant. Attainable dreams parked on driveways across Britain. That whale tail has become an icon of the decade, and frankly, nothing's replaced it in terms of sheer emotional punch. We miss that car. Rover was British, and that mattered. The Rover 25, the Rover 45, the Rover 75 with its leather interior and proper wood trim. These were cars that felt like home on wheels. The 25 was a proper little city car, economical, reliable, and with a charm that modern Fords and Vauxhalls just don't have. The styling was timeless, and if you wanted something that said, "I've got taste but I'm not pretentious," you bought a Rover. Then BMW took over, ruined it all, and by 2005, Rover was dead. The brand vanished, and suddenly British drivers had to buy foreign cars or settle for Japanese imports. The Rover 25 could have competed with the modern Mini if they'd just invested properly, but they didn't. Every time you see one on the road now, which isn't often, it's a reminder of what we lost. Britain used to make proper cars. Now we just assemble them for other people. The Vauxhall Cavalier was everywhere in the 90s. Company cars, family runabouts, first cars for young lads, the Cavalier was the reliable workhorse that Britain ran on. It wasn't exciting, but it was honest. You could thrash it about and it would keep coming back for more. The engines were solid, the parts were cheap, and if something went wrong, any mechanic could sort it in his sleep. Now they're practically extinct. A few survive, mostly in scrapyards or being lovingly restored by nostalgic owners. The Cavalier was replaced by the Vectra, which nobody really wanted, and then Vauxhall just gave up on the family car market altogether. In the 90s, you knew 3 blokes with Cavaliers. Now you'd be lucky to spot one in a year. It was the backbone of British motoring, and we took it completely for granted. The Ford Escort was the car that launched 1,000 first dates. It was affordable, it looked decent, and if you got one with the 1.6 or the XR3i engine, it actually went a bit. Young men learned to drive in Escorts, young couples had their first adventures in Escorts, and working blokes relied on Escort vans to make their living. The XR3i was the performance version, and it had a certain swagger that made even a basic car feel special. The Escort represented a time when British Ford could genuinely compete with the Europeans. Now they're mostly gone, crushed in scrapyards or rotting in fields. Occasionally you'll see one lovingly restored at a car meet, and people gather round like it's a museum piece. But in the 90s, it was just a normal car, something you didn't think twice about. That's the tragedy of it. We didn't appreciate what we had while we had it. The Austin Maestro was quirky, British, and utterly bonkers in the best possible way. That square body, those massive windows, the ergonomic steering wheel that looked like something from a spaceship, it was different. People either loved it or thought it was hideous, but nobody ignored it. In the 90s, you'd still see plenty of them, especially in university towns where students drove them because they were cheap and cheerful. The Maestro represented everything about British engineering eccentricity. We didn't do things the safe way, we did them our way. When production ended and they disappeared, something uniquely British went with them. Now, when you see an old Maestro, it's almost a shock. How did something so distinctive simply vanish? They're cult classics now, but in the 90s, they were just mental little cars that got you from A to B, while making everyone laugh at your sense of humour. The Peugeot 205 was the thinking person's city car. It handled like a dream. It was efficient. And it had a certain French sophistication that appealed to blokes who wanted something a bit different. The GTI version was legendary, a proper little pocket rocket that could embarrass far more expensive cars. In the 90s, you'd see hundreds of them on British roads, especially the 1.9 GTI version that everyone coveted. The 205 set the standard for how a city car should drive and feel. Every car since has been compared to it, and most have come up short. They've almost completely disappeared now, and when you do see one, it's usually being cherished by an enthusiast who remembers what it was like to have a car that rewarded proper driving. The 205 proved that you didn't need a big engine to have fun, and that lesson's been forgotten by modern manufacturers obsessed with size and power. While most Stags had vanished by the 90s, a few brave souls were still keeping them on the road, and they represented a golden era of British sports cars. The Stag was a proper convertible, a genuine British rival to the Jaguar E-Type's legacy, and it had character by the bucket load. Those who owned them in the 90s were keeping history alive, and every time one hit the road, it was an event. The Stag represented a time when Britain made sports cars that turned heads and stirred souls. Now the only Stags you see are at classic car shows, carefully preserved by people who understand their significance. The fact that so few survived the 90s is a reminder of how disposable we used to treat our cars. A Stag from the 90s represents the last breath of genuine British sports car manufacturing, before it became an Italian or German game. The Rover 820. Turbo was an attempt to make a proper British executive car, and for a moment, it actually worked. That turbocharged engine gave it real performance, and the interior was properly luxurious. Businessmen drove them, and they had a certain understated gravitas that made you feel like you'd made it in life. It was faster than equivalent Audis and BMWs, and it was cheaper too. But reliability issues and poor marketing meant it never quite got the respect it deserved. By the mid-90s, it was already disappearing, overtaken by the Germans who had better dealers and better marketing. Now they're incredibly rare, and when one turns up, it's usually being restored by someone who remembers what Rover was trying to do. The 820 Turbo was a missed opportunity. If the quality had been there, Rover might have survived. Instead, it's a footnote in British motoring history. The Ford Fiesta MK3 was the car that taught millions of young Brits how to drive. It was small, it was nimble, and when you got to 18, that was your first car. The XR2 version was the performance variant, and it had a cult following among enthusiasts. These cars were absolutely everywhere in the 90s. You couldn't drive down a street without seeing 3 or 4. Now they've vanished, crushed, rusted away, or exported to Eastern Europe, where they're still being thrashed about. Occasionally, you'll see one at a car meet, and people will swap stories about learning to drive in one, about their first dates, their first breakdowns. The MK3 Fiesta was indestructible, cheap to fix, and brilliant fun. It represented a time when cars were still simple enough for a teenager to understand and maintain. Modern Fiestas are computers on wheels compared to the mechanical honesty of the MK3. The Vauxhall Nova was the car for lasses who wanted a bit of go. It was feminine without being fussy, nippy without being expensive, and utterly reliable. You'd see them everywhere in the 90s, parked outside offices, supermarkets and university halls. The GSI version had a turbo, and plenty of young women proved they could handle a proper performance car just as well as any lad in his Escort. The Nova had a certain egalitarian charm. It didn't matter if you were a student, a nurse, or a businesswoman. A Nova made sense. It was affordable, efficient, and fun. Now they're almost completely gone, and when you see one, it's usually being lovingly restored by someone who remembers that car with genuine affection. The Nova proved that performance cars didn't need to be masculine or aggressive. They just needed to deliver on their promise. That's something modern marketing has completely forgotten. The Daimler V12 was a rare sight even in the 90s, but those who saw one understood that British craftsmanship still meant something. That V12 engine, the leather interior, the hand-stitched detailing, it was a car for people who understood quality and weren't afraid to pay for it. It was understated, elegant, and utterly British in its refusal to shout about how good it was. By the end of the 90s, even these had started to disappear as Jaguar repositioned itself for the modern market. The V12 represents the last of a particular type of British luxury car, one that didn't need to prove itself against Germans or Italians because it knew exactly what it was. These days, you'll see one maybe once a year at a concours event, and it always draws a crowd of people who remember when British meant something special in the luxury market. The Jaguar XJS was a proper British Grand Tourer, a car that could eat up motorways and make you feel like you were in a proper sports car. In the 90s, these were still relatively common sights on British roads. You'd see them at golf clubs, parked outside country hotels, driven by retired businessmen who'd earned their stripes. The V12 engine was glorious, even if it did consume petrol like it was going out of fashion. Now they're vanishing fast. Insurance costs and fuel prices have made them uneconomical for most owners, and the market for specialist repair work is shrinking. The XJS represented a golden era of British motoring, when manufacturers could still build cars that prioritised drive and character over emissions and efficiency. Every time one disappears from the road, Britain loses a little bit of its automotive heritage. The XJS wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably, defiantly British. The Nissan Sunny was the Japanese alternative for blokes who wanted reliability without the British compromise. They were economical, they were tough, and they just kept working. In the 90s, they represented the moment when Japanese reliability started winning over British loyalty. Young lads who couldn't afford a proper performance car would buy a Sunny and modify it, because the engines were bulletproof and parts were cheap. By the end of the decade, Sunnys had largely disappeared, overtaken by more modern Japanese imports. The few that survive are usually heavily modified, kept alive by enthusiasts who understand what they represent. The moment when British car culture started looking eastward. The Sunny wasn't exciting, but it was honest, and that honesty won over plenty of drivers who'd grown tired of British electrical gremlins and rust. The Rover Metro was the plucky little British car that could. It was small, it was economical, and it had a certain charm that made even driving a minicar feel like fun. In the 90s, it evolved into the Rover 100, and still people loved it. It was affordable, it was British, and you could actually afford to run it. Students, pensioners, and young professionals all drove Metros because they made sense on a small budget. Now they've virtually disappeared from British roads. A few are lovingly maintained by nostalgic owners, but the Metro/100 represents a time when British cars could compete on price and practicality without needing to be exciting. It was honest, unpretentious motoring, and that's something we've lost. Every Metro that gets scrapped is a reminder that Britain's not in the business of making simple, affordable, reliable cars anymore. We outsourced that responsibility years ago. The Renault 5 was the French upstart that stole British hearts. It was cute, it was efficient, and it represented a certain continental sophistication. In the 90s, you'd still see plenty of them. especially the GT Turbo version that had real performance tucked into that tiny frame. Young drivers loved them because they were different from the British offerings, and they actually worked. The Renault 5 showed that you didn't need to be British to build a proper little car. It was nimble, fun, and affordable, and it proved that French engineering could match British engineering on enthusiasm, if not on heritage. Now they're almost completely gone from British roads, a reminder of a time when car choice actually meant something. The Renault 5 represents a moment when we had alternatives, when the market had genuine choice. Now we're all driving essentially the same car with different badges. The Volvo 740 and 940 were the cars for people who valued safety and solidity over style. They were tanks, basically. You could crash one and walk away because Volvo understood that cars needed to protect their occupants. In the 90s, you'd see plenty of them, especially as company cars for sales reps and businessmen who weren't interested in fashion. These Volvos represented an era when you could choose a car based on pragmatism rather than being forced to follow fashion. They were boring, admittedly, but they were reliable, they were safe, and they did the job for 200,000 miles if you looked after them. Now they've mostly vanished, replaced by crossovers and SUVs that promise safety but deliver bloat instead of substance. The Volvo 740 proved that you could sell cars on honesty. That lesson's been forgotten in the pursuit of profit. The Ford Escort van was the backbone of British commerce. Every plumber, electrician and decorator drove one. It was simple, it was reliable, and it could carry a full load of tools and materials without complaint. In the 90s, they were everywhere on building sites and in industrial estates. These weren't glamorous cars, but they were vital to how Britain worked. Now they've virtually disappeared, replaced by modern transit vans that are more sophisticated but less characterful. The Escort van represented a time when commercial vehicles were just simpler versions of their passenger car cousins. Now they're completely different beasts, designed by computers and managed by complex electronics. The Escort van proved that you didn't need to overcomplicate a workhorse. Miss the simplicity? You're not the only one. Working Britain ran on these vans and they deserved more respect. The Peugeot 405 was a proper mid-range family car that competed directly with the Cavalier and the Sierra. It was French, but it felt European in a way that made British cars look provincial. In the 90s, they were common sights, especially as taxis and company cars. The engine was efficient, the handling was competent, and it represented the moment when French cars became credible competitors to British marques. By the late 90s, the 405 was already disappearing, overtaken by newer designs and market shifts. Now they're incredibly rare on British roads, mostly kept alive in specialist taxi firms in London or being restored by enthusiasts. The 405 represented the last of Peugeot's proper attempts to compete in the mainstream British market. After this, Peugeot largely withdrew, leaving the field to Germans and Japanese. The 405 was a good car, and we didn't appreciate it while we had the chance. The Austin Montego was Britain's attempt to compete with the Golf and the Astra, and for a moment, it actually worked. It was spacious, it was practical, and it had a certain charm that made you feel like you'd made the right choice. In the 90s, you'd see plenty of them on British roads, driven by families who appreciated the extra space and the lower cost compared to the opposition. But reliability issues and poor perception meant the Montego never got the respect it deserved. By the mid-90s, production had ended and they were already becoming rarer. Now they're almost extinct, a reminder of Leyland's last serious attempt to make a proper family car. The Montego proved that Britain could still compete, but only if quality and marketing backed up the design. When they didn't, the Montego slipped into obscurity. Every time an old Montego gets scrapped, it's a small reminder of what British motoring lost. This is the big one. In the 90s, you could go down any street in Britain and see cars that were actually British. Rovers, Vauxhalls, Fords made in Britain, Austins, Jaguars, all flying the flag for British engineering. It wasn't always perfect, but it was ours. Young men could aspire to own a British performance car. Working blokes could buy a practical British runabout. Businessmen could choose a British executive saloon. Now, British-built cars are a minority on British roads. We assemble foreign cars for foreign companies, but we don't make our own anymore. The 90s were the last decade when being a British motorist meant something specific, when you had a genuine choice between British and foreign. That's gone now. Every time you see an old British car from the 90s on the road, it represents not just nostalgia for a machine, but nostalgia for an entire industry that we let slip away. We used to make proper cars. Now we just drive them. From the Cosworth's turbo whistle to the Escort's reliability, from Rovers to Fiestas, the 90s gave us cars that meant something before we forgot what we had. If this brought back memories of your first motor, hit subscribe and watch the next video on screen. Cheers for watching.